Well, thank you so much, Dan. I really want to thank the organizers for this invitation. It's always an opportunity to talk about what I think is the most important fundamental issue that we have in cardiovascular disease. And it's interesting how if you look at this list of causes of death around the world, and you look at like research allocations and funds for programs, we probably don't spend nearly enough time and effort worrying about the heart and circulatory disorders and prevention compared to the number of people who are actually suffering from these diseases. This came out just a few months ago at the European Society of Cardiology, and it's got stunning information that it's no longer, infectious diseases that are a leading cause of death in the low and middle income countries. And interestingly enough, high-income countries in general have cancer as the leading cause, but unfortunately, the United States and Australia, probably the only two high-income countries where heart disease is still the #1 killer. The burden, you've seen this over and over again. What you may not have seen is that last bullet point. It's one of the reasons that I spend so much time worrying about cardiovascular disease, not just my own genetic background, but where I grew up and where I've served at University of Chicago on the south side and now Rush on the west side. We were inundated with cardiovascular disease in the adult African-American population. It's not just the south side of Chicago, though. This is actually a global issue, and there's good data saying that if you look at it carefully, sodium, not having enough whole grains, if you look at the dietary quality around the world, 11 million deaths is just a massive amount of unnecessary death that could be prevented. But 255 million disability-adjusted life years, that's an opportunity for people to live better lives and be more productive and make the planet better. So it's something that we all should be taking very seriously. Now, this conference, looking at the lineup, is a lot about this. You may recognize this. This is Betsy Nabel and Gene Braunwald in New England Journal of Medicine talking about the things that you're going to hear a lot of this and how tremendously we've improved cardiovascular mortality over the last 4 decades with a variety of things. The one thing they left off was that shoulder where it starts to go down. That's when nuclear cardiology started, by the way. I just want to point that out. So, as it turns out, all of that has really been characterized as mopping up the floor instead of turning off the faucet. And, that's what we do. We treat heart disease, but how about stopping it before it actually starts? Because someday there's going to be a price to pay. And that came out in 2015 from the CDC. It said diabetes and obesity have made it so that decline stopped, and it's been on the rise ever since. The growing epidemic of obesity is being highlighted. This was actually a few months ago in the Wall Street Journal, talking about not just heart attacks and heart attack deaths, but having them occur at younger ages. And it really does boil down to what we at the American College of Cardiology and the AHA getting together, writing guidelines, trying to fundamentally change the underpinning, and that would be the obesity, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. So we do have the answer, which is the ACC AHA 2019 Primary Prevention Guidelines. I'm hoping that everyone has read them, memorized them. You have the pocket card and the T-shirt. And just to summarize it, if you haven't seen it, we could talk about tobacco cessation, controlling cholesterol, high blood pressure recommendations. Everybody should be, getting out of the chair, doing more physical activity, using aspirin only in the higher risk people. #rethink aspirin. Controlling diabetes, getting rid of it as best we can, and using the new agents that can actually improve cardiovascular outcomes. But diet is a fundamental piece of it, and I'm hoping that everyone will actually read that, and that section has a lot of information, some of which we'll go through today, to try to fight the obesity epidemic that we have. The 78 million and growing, it really has been isolated that the issue is nutrition. That is, yes, exercise. You can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. It'll help, but it's not going to solve the problem. The refined grains, big meals, sugary drinks, red meat, these are the issues. Not enough of the healthy stuff of whole grains and nuts and fresh fruits and vegetables. And a lot of that is actually fast food. This is something that's taking over our country, particularly in the African American community, where on average, folks are going to fast food on 4 to 7 times a week. If I could get everybody to understand one thing about weight control, it would be the issue of calorie density. That if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, you're not getting as many calories and you're getting a lot more full compared to eating an animal protein or eating oil. And if we could change portion size and go back to the 1950s, we'd be a lot better off. If you look at obesity interventions, they all are saying the same thing. And everyone will argue about, keto diet, which is basically Atkins, and versus Weight Watchers, which is calorie control, and Ornish, which is completely vegan. And the issue is all of them will lose weight. And what they all have in common is calorie restriction, one way or another. If you look at sustaining the weight loss, there are randomized trials that have looked very carefully at this, and yeah, you do better with plant-based nutrition than you do with the others, but all of them revolve around decreasing calories. I'm going to focus on diabetes and hypertension, and this is really why. The top is talking about all causes of death around the world, but the B panel, cardiovascular deaths, if you isolated that one thing that you could do that would decrease a lot, it really is systemic hypertension. And we have good data on nutrition and hypertension, mostly a lot of it from not too far from here in Adventist Health Studies 1 and 2, where Gary Fraser has looked at observational, large, long-term, but observational trials because people self-select, maybe them and their families or their parents, as the standard American diet, cutting the meat some, eating fish, doing what the Adventist Health people have always said, lacto-ovo vegetarian, and then many people who buck the trend and do vegan, particularly in California. And they have enough data to do a table like this one. If you compare those 5 diets, the only people who are not body mass index more than 25, that is overweight or obese, are the vegans. If you look at the amount of diabetes and hypertension, that is the lowest that you're going to get. If you look at the mortality statistics, we're talking about a 30% reduction in mortality from ischemic heart disease, cardiovascular disease. And if you look at longevity, you see that the standard American diet in red is going down, down, down with age, and plant-based nutrition is going up for people are converting and people not dying. What does it really mean if you do one of those intermediate diets? Anything, everything with moderation is just moderate amounts of dying. And so you can actually take that decade or 9.5 years in men and almost do a linear, the number of times you do plant-based as opposed to animal-based diet, you will get that percentage of that extra decade of life. It's not just a decade of life, it's a decade of living. They're 30 pounds lighter, they're more active, less insulin resistant, et cetera, and so less disease and more enjoyment of their life. Now, they don't stand alone. There are lots of trials that have actually looked at vegetarian diets and blood pressure. A lot of these are all prospective randomized trials, and it is true that the ones that are completely plant-based tend to do better, but in general, just cutting the animal products, which happens to and eating more plants, which increases the potassium, increases and decreases the amount of sodium, will actually improve the blood pressure significantly. That did make its way into our guidelines, and a lot of people were upset at us for changing the definition to 130/80. And they were saying that our committee was conflicted and that we were all in the hands of the pharmaceutical industry, and that just meant that they didn't read the document. Because this is what we were focusing on with our 2017 hypertension guideline, which is non-pharmacologic intervention. Everybody should be exercising. Different types of exercise actually have independent reduction of the blood pressure. Decreasing the amount of alcohol, losing weight if you're overweight, cutting the sodium to less than 1,500, having milligrams, having more potassium, 3,500 milligrams or more. And most important, in green and bold, doing as much of a plant-based diet as you can, and that has the biggest numerical impact on blood pressure. If you look at the DASH diet that underpins of our recommendation, you can actually look in the DASH diet, that red line of the people who do very little in saturated fat and cholesterol. That really does mean a plant-based diet predominantly, if not exclusively, and you see that's where the biggest drop in blood pressure actually occurs. I'm going to switch over and talk about sugar and sweeteners because it's probably the one thing that most of us didn't understand. With good reasons. For a long time, people were not recognizing the relationship between sugar sweeteners and cardiovascular disease. This is the mechanism right here. It's not just what happens to your blood sugar, it's what happens to your insulin. It's a wonderful growth hormone, and it is incredibly able to accelerate atherosclerosis when your insulin levels are high. And so you see all of our type 2 diabetics with these massive insulin levels, they are developing plaque all the time. So really don't sugarcoat it. If it turns out everyone is familiar with hemoglobin A1C, not realizing that it's not just red blood cells that get glycated. You actually glycate LDL cholesterol. It makes it prothrombotic and proatherogenic. And yes, you can actually reverse all that if you lower the sugar in the diet. The other thing that's really important that people don't quite realize, with all due respect to the things that we're drinking out there, we really shouldn't be drinking calories. When you do, you can get a spike in actually inflammation. So if you measure C-reactive protein 30 minutes after a sugary drink, it actually goes high and stays high for a couple of hours. And as you know, C-reactive protein, along with LDL cholesterol, are two of the leading correlates with heart attack, stroke, and death. And so it's no surprise that 6 years ago, JAMA had this article showing this curvilinear relationship between sugar intake and mortality. Hopefully that caught everyone's attention, but we really should have known it. This is Walter Willett and the Harvard group, and I don't know how many nurses we have. How many nurses? Great. And how many nurses in the Nurses' Health Study? Okay, you're going to get an applause. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. All right, thanks for doing that. So it turns out that they identified it over a decade ago. That is, what makes nurses die? Yes, smoking is bad, diabetes is worse, getting older is the worst. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. But the nutrition stuff was just startling. You eat fiber, you die less. You eat an animal product, you increase your death rate. But a glycemic load, eating the glazed donut, was actually worse than eating the hamburger by point estimate. And so it's something that we should have known for a while. Have to extend that to artificially sweetened beverages because the amount of data being collected showing that they correlate with mortality is actually going up. I had an American Heart Association statement about this. It is a little bit better than caloric sugar, 31% versus 13%, but both increases in mortality are totally unnecessary. If you look at the relationship between dietary patterns and diabetes risk, it's very startling that the more plant-based you have, the more plant-based you are, there's almost a linear relationship between the more plants, the less diabetes. And this is a lot of studies put together, not just Adventist Health Study. Now, how about once you have the diabetes? Can you do something about it with diet? Absolutely. If you do vegetarian diet trying to improve glycemic control, there are multiple randomized trials all pointing in the same direction that your hemoglobin A1C is going to dramatically get better. More importantly, this was published last year, and it was kind of stunning that we all expected that if you do a plant-based diet, the person's weight is going to go down, their cholesterol is going to get better, you're going to see hemoglobin A1C looks great, but most of us did not expect emotional well-being, physical well-being, depression, quality of life, general health. All of those are the kinds of things you hear when people say, oh, I went vegan, I just feel great. Apparently, it's actually true. Okay. All right. Now, focusing in for a moment just because of the recent literature on this, on sugar-sweetened beverages, it's really important to recognize that they're everywhere and that we all can do something about it. We could all go back to our employers and say, why don't we do this ban that's published in JAMA? The sugar-sweetened beverages are pointing out 180,000 deaths, and that when you're doing this, 34% of the added sugar in the American diet comes from these energy drinks and fruit drinks and the like. And there's a much higher risk, as we've pointed out. If you make that intervention, just talking to people, that's in the dark bar, it actually makes a difference. If you do a sales ban, it also makes a difference. People can go somewhere else and get it if they don't have the information, but they put the two together, ban it and tell people why. It seems to make a huge difference, and it actually lowers lean body mass, and you can actually do this. And what happens to your workplace when people are healthier? Everybody's more productive and happy. To sum up, if you look at the information on diabetes and prevention as well as intervention, it's very clear that their association with eating refined carbohydrates, with the insulin spike, insulin resistance, the central obesity is very clear. Red meat actually elevates the risk of type 2 diabetes, and it's only partially mediated by the increase in body mass. And if you really want to get glycemic control, we cut the red meat, we stop the animal products, we cut the saturated fat, get polyunsaturated fats instead of sugar, and we would do much better. Now since I've segued a little bit in the diabetes section to fat, I really should point out that fat is one of the things you hear so much more about. You hear, big fat surprise by, your Time magazine, butter is back, and people leave themselves totally confused. One of the ones that was sort of data-driven about this that sort of added to the controversy were the PURE trials where Salim Yusuf and his group, very insightful. And Salim's a good friend, and I just tell him, you really should clarify that when you're saying that carbohydrates are worse than fat, you should clarify that it's refined carbohydrates. It's right in the methods, but it's not in the abstract, it's not in the conclusion. So we're talking about white rice, where you've taken the real husk of it off, white sugar, white flour. If you do all that, that really is more dangerous, as we talked about in the last section. Yes, replacing carbohydrates with polyunsaturated fats does lower mortality, but that's because these are poor carbohydrates, and it's something that we are inundated with in our diet in our restaurants. If you look at dietary fats and cardiovascular disease, you'll see a lot of controversy in the vegan community, people going back and forth against each other. Should be no oil, little oil, extra virgin olive oil, and some of them get ridiculous in terms of the intensity, and hopefully everybody isn't following that on Twitter, because having the vegans fight each other over this just makes no sense. I try to tell them, we have bigger fish to fry, of course, without the fish and without the frying. But it's very clear that the saturated fat is bad for you. We should be doing more on saturated fat. We have data on cause-specific mortality. No one's doing trans fat. I had, like 15 slides on trans fat, and I took them out. Why? Because it's illegal in the United States, Denmark, Switzerland, and Canada. So you don't get this in restaurants anymore. But saturated, the more you eat, the more you die, and the more you substitute monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, the better you do. Replacing just 5% of saturated fat with polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, 27% reduction in mortality. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about cholesterol inflammation, because they're both really important. It's something that most of us don't get trained in. How much cholesterol is in what? Well, Google will tell us, but we don't get that training in medical school or in nursing school. Pretty much every animal product, with few exceptions, has cholesterol, and plant-based items do not. And the one exception would be egg whites, and Jell-O, and honey. Those are the three animal products that do not have cholesterol. The problem with egg whites in this country is that most people are eating egg whites with egg yolks. Okay. If you look at dietary intervention, can you lower C-reactive protein and LDL cholesterol? You absolutely can. This was a randomized trial called the PORFOLIO diet. There's a lot of plant sterols, a lot of viscous fibers, adding almonds 3 times a day, soy protein, put all that together, and then compare it to a statin. In this case, it was 20 milligrams of lovastatin. It's not the strongest statin. But the 30% reduction in LDL was tremendous. Same thing happened with C-reactive protein. So people started calling vegan diets the anti-inflammatory diet. That has been confirmed. Really proud of the American Heart Association for publishing this. Bonita Shah in New York put this together and showed that, if you want an anti-inflammatory diet, you do a large population, make them vegan, the CRP goes down. And if you do the American Heart Association diet, it does not. So good on them that they published something against their own diet. If you look at the larger amount of data This is another one of those Neil Barnard meta-analyses with the curve. With almost completely uniformly, you see that as you drop cholesterol, despite what people say, cholesterol doesn't affect, your diet doesn't affect your cholesterol, it absolutely does. You remove the animal products, you remove the source of cholesterol. You do have to deal with your own cholesterol, and the more fiber you eat, the more of that cholesterol is going to go out into the stool. Leaving that portion, I want to talk about dietary patterns and mortality, because we've had in the last 5 years some amazingly insightful stuff that's been published. Everybody should be is familiar with what they call the Southern diet. That'd be fried chicken, taking your greens and putting neck bones or ham hocks or something in it, a lot of sweet tea, and a large amount of saturated fat. That has been called out by the University of Alabama folks who were looking at causes of stroke in the stroke belt, that is the major cause. And that Southern diet, much more heart disease, much more kidney disease, much more stroke, something that would be totally avoidable if we just changed the pattern. Another pattern that was pointed out from Nurses Health was actually, it was very insightful, published in JAMA in 2017, and it told us what we needed to know. That is, what you're seeing here is the cut point for where death starts to happen. And so with sodium, it's more than 2,000 milligrams. Not enough nuts and seeds. A high amount of processed meat, I just smile because high is defined as greater than 0. That means any ever. Okay. Not enough seafood, that really is a substitutionary benefit. If you're more seafood, less red meat, you absolutely live longer. Not enough vegetables, not enough fruit. Oh, and sugar-sweetened beverages, a high amount, defined as any ever, so in more than 0. And so we do have what we can make a healthy pattern just by taking this table and designing our diet around it. But I have to put out a warning to the vegans, because as you probably know, most of the vegans, even in Southern California, are not about cardiovascular disease and wanting to decrease that. They're really about animal rights, social, environmental concerns, all of which are important. But a lot of those vegans will eat anything as long as it didn't have a face and it didn't have a mother. But if you're talking about French fries and vegan cupcakes and the like, having components of saturated fat and refined flour and a lot of sugar, it turns out, much to their chagrin, that the graph on the right, coronary heart disease incidence, that red line is the more animal products you eat, the more you die, and the dotted line above it is an unhealthy plant-based diet. You die even faster. Okay. And that's very consistent with the Nurses Health, right? That more carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, is worse than eating animals. Okay. Got to deal with the ketogenic diet. It's everywhere. It's paleo, it's Atkins, carnivore diet. Does it work for weight loss? Absolutely. What's the problem with it? Just the dying part. Okay. So this, and we should have known this a long time ago. This is 2007 was the first time that someone called it out and said 22% increase in mortality if people do this more than a year or so. But it was published multiple times. This one is from Japan. The low-carb diets increase all-cause mortality. They said it was about a 31% increase in mortality. And this is probably, I would think, the gold standard, not just because it was in Lancet Public Health, a very serious journal, but because they looked at both sides of the equation. High carb is bad for you, low carb is bad for you. Optimal is making sure that your carbohydrates are complex carbohydrates. And if you're going to do a low-carb diet, it better be with plants. That is, vegetables, nuts, peanut butter, whole grain breads. That actually lowered mortality by 18%, as opposed to doing it with animals, which increased mortality in their estimate by 18%. Beautiful curve, very much consistent with the PURE trial. The more carbs you eat, the more mortality you have. PURE did not look at the low-carb side, but that increasing mortality is very serious. In a cardiology group, I have to point out this one, though, from H.E.A.R.T a few years ago. Very serious that there are a lot of people trying to lose weight after a heart attack. This is not the way. You don't see too many interventions that you could do that would increase your mortality by 53%. And that's what happens if you do a low-carb diet post-myocardial infarction. We have more data on what the mechanism is. It's basically cholesterol and inflammation. Just the opposite of that portfolio thing where the curves drop. You do a ketogenic diet, it actually goes up. So if you want to get rid of the LDL And C-reactive protein, this would not be the way by eating a lot of animal products because they go in the wrong direction. The National Lipid Association put this out just a few months ago. If you want to take a good look at it, Carol Kirkpatrick, it was great because I used to debate her. She was on the keto side until she saw the data. Now she's the lead author on the Don't Do It Ever article showing that the LDL goes up, weight goes down, no question, but and hemoglobin A1C definitely goes down, but there's better ways to fight diabetes without dying. Okay. Let's talk about eggs, because we have more data than we ever had before, and it's really important. I always joke that you hear all this stuff that eggs are good for you, and that's because of the egg board, and I wish they worked for me. They're amazing people. They can take really bad data and spin it such that it looks like they're getting something that's actually good for you, but just remember this. There's a linear increase in mortality. The more eggs you eat, the more you die, and the cut point is about a half an egg per day. Now, upsetting to many of the vegans in the world is that bottom line, and Don Lloyd Jones is a good friend, and he was one of the lead authors on this, and he's just excited that I tweeted it out this way because I know a lot of people, vegans, are following me, but what it actually said is that if you take that model and you adjust it for cholesterol consumption, which means egg whites essentially would drive it down to zero, the mortality signal goes away. So, there may be other issues with egg whites, but it's not coronary heart disease. Okay, back to red meat. If you look at that, the problems that you have with ketogenic diet, most of it is because of the red meat. Red meat kills, processed red meat kills faster, but it's not just cardiovascular disease, it's cancer, total mortality, it's dose related. That whole idea of moderation, the biggest slope is between 0 and 1 serving per day. And it's not just heart attack, stroke, and death, it's heart failure. And so there's a unique relationship. I was talking about that 1.53. Well, this hazard ratio is 2.43. So anyone who's in a heart failure clinic, and I think our next talk is heart failure, make them vegan, okay? It makes a big difference. I do want to talk about fish a little bit because everyone thinks that fish will save you, and it comes out in multiple trials that fish is good for you. It turns out fish is not good for you. It's just that it's so much better than eating red meat, eggs, or processed red meat. So stare at the title for a moment. What I like to joke is that if you've got a patient and they're about to take a cyanide pill and there's arsenic on the table, give them the arsenic instead, okay? So, okay, maybe that's a little cruel, but what I'm really driving at was published in 2016, again from Nurses Health and Health Professional Follow-Up. People will point out correctly. Please take a look at that title, sort of mentally memorize it for a moment. There's a reason for doing that, okay? And I always show this extra slide on the methods to remind myself to say this is people who have at least one risk factor, which is most of us and all of our patients. And this is the data. There are no safe animal products. Every single one of them increases mortality in a statistically significant manner. It's just that fish, poultry, and dairy are significantly better than unprocessed meat, which is better than eggs, which is better than processed red meat, okay? Now, the reason I want you to look at the title here is because of this. You don't see that happen in a major journal, that they publish the same paper twice, not the same paper. Same title, it's not the same country. It's actually a Japanese prospective cohort. It turns out very similar with a few odd exceptions. In their cardiovascular disease section at the bottom here, this is the only trial I've ever seen where somebody said that red meat and processed meat were the same. I can't explain that, but maybe I just don't know enough about Japanese processed meat. But this was very similar. The whole idea here with all of these dots is you take animal protein and you replace it with vegetable protein and mortality goes down. Okay. People always talk about the Predimed trial, as well they should, because they did prospective randomized and they got a 30% reduction. I didn't show the retraction and the repeat, but what they failed to see, and this is U.S. News and World Report a few weeks ago saying that this was the #1 diet. Well, except for one thing. It did not decrease mortality. It did increase heart attack. So heart attack, stroke, and death reduction of 30% was almost all stroke. And people don't realize that if you're talking about a controlled diet, getting rid of the red meat, replacing it with more chicken and a lot of fish, you will decrease some of the risk factors. You will not decrease mortality, okay? Okay. However, if you do what you really should do, which, and I was really glad that Emilio Ross, who's a good friend and on our ACC committee, do the right thing. Go and look at the vegetarian population inside the Mediterranean diet, the so-called pro-vegetarian, or I call it the vegetarian diet. It was a massive reduction in mortality. Those highest quintiles of vegetable intake, 42% reduction in mortality. So vegetarian diets do work in pretty much every setting. This came out 2 days ago, so I had to put it in here. The whole idea of processed meat, unprocessed meat, poultry, fish, all of them actually increase. This is Phil Greenland, who's at Northwestern. It's a completely different data set than what we've been looking at before. So it's not just Harvard telling people not to eat animals. It's pretty much every cohort that looks at you eat animals, you die faster. These were the curves. I wouldn't spend a lot of time looking at it, but the real idea is that, it's dose related. Okay, in the last couple minutes, I want to talk about the whole idea of protein, because people say that you can't get it. It is not true. Beef and peanuts are the same. Egg whites are much less than nuts, and about what quinoa is. And if you want to have the most amount of protein, it's really lentils and soybeans, not chicken and pork. And if you don't do the vegetable protein, you're going to develop this 4-letter word. If you haven't seen it, please write it down, put it in Google in your phone, look at all the stuff, because you will be shocked that as you eat animal products with phosphatidylcholine, choline, betaine, you will develop in your gut flora the ability to make trimethylamine, which then takes you into trimethylamine N oxide, which correlates with heart attack, stroke, and death. That's one of their first publications in New England Journal of Medicine. But it shows an increase in platelet aggregation as well as plaque development, and it increases heart failure death. Okay. Interestingly enough, that heart failure data is, I pulled all these out just for you. Okay. The fact of the matter is, if you intervene in that heart failure population, probably the reason that Kyle Lara was able to show a 41% decrease in heart failure associated admissions was because you're dropping the TMAO level. It's all maybe sodium as well. But you do the Southern diet, you increase heart failure. You do a plant-based diet, you decrease risk of heart failure. Very clear. Now, if we step back and look at all the literature as I'm summing up, in hazards of eating red meat, it's diabetes, it's heart failure, it's coronary heart disease and stroke. Other than that, no problem. The mechanisms are a variety of them. I didn't spend time talking about all of them, but on the left, TMAO is too large to ignore now. It's not just the Cleveland Clinic. People understand how important that is. But right in the middle there, that heme iron, I have to point that out because it was our National Institutes of Health and AARP and health study that showed that it's not just the nitrates and nitrites and processed red meat. The mortality with meat has to do with heme iron. That's been around for a while, that you should not be getting your iron from animals. If you do, it is oxidized ferric ions as opposed to the ferrous ions that you get from vegetables. And that the oxidized iron actually does lead to peroxidation of lipids, more inflammation, instability of plaque, and ischemic events. I've got a minute and a half left, so I can talk a little bit about the craziness that happened last September with Annals of Internal Medicine, what many people said very irresponsibly doing these self-appointed guidelines that turned out to say that even though all the literature says there's some negative effects, we're going to add it all up and say people should be eating as much red meat as they're doing now. And didn't disclose that they were tied to the meat industry. There was a lot of response to that, so I don't have to spend too much time doing it. Everyone came out and was very clear. I think it actually helped galvanize people to stop eating red meat because the data is so clear. Got some really good data. I'm going to spend the last few seconds talking about our ACC/AHA prevention guidelines and the nutrition section. Please look it up. You're going to see our 5 recommendations, which are going to encompass everything we just said: more fruits and vegetables, less saturated fat, less cholesterol, and as part of a healthy diet, making sure that you're decreasing red meat, processed meat in particular, sugar-sweetened beverages, and as a part of a heart-healthy diet, you want to get rid of all the trans fats. We can actually do that. We did it prospectively at Rush on the south side of Chicago in an African-American church as a nutrition intervention. This actually is a famous church on the south side because Obama went there. And what we saw by getting them to volunteer to give up animal products for 5 weeks, a dramatic drop in insulin. Yeah, the weight went down, blood pressure went down, everything improved significantly. TMAO levels, 43% decrease. LDL, small dense LDL had a huge improvement. So you can take an at-risk population, and obviously we use our ACC/AHA risk calculator. The H.E.A.R.T stands for Helping Everyone Assess Risk Today. We do that with the little app. And the fact of the matter is we were able to decrease their atherosclerotic disease risk by 21% in that population, by 19%. And so we're hoping that everyone will do your own intervention and lower the risk. And hopefully I can, myself professed, I'm not retiring until heart disease is number 2. Maybe you guys can help me retire. Thank you very much. Okay.